Today is December 14th, 2017. Hope you're having a happy holiday season. I'm going to go through a few parts to this book, NurtureShock. It's a fantastic book that I think really introduces some new thinking and challenges some of our basic assumptions. And the first chapter, which I thought deserved its own webinar, I think is maybe the most important, my favorite chapter of the book. What I like about this book to begin is I like it because it doesn't necessarily, like what I teach, it doesn't tell you what to do. It informs you and challenges or debunks some of the myths that I think so many of us in our culture adhere to or believe in. There's so many things that we take as common sense that the research shows are not common sense, in fact, are not true at all. And so tonight I'm going to talk about that first thing being the universe power of praise. The chapter begins with a wonderful chapter heading that I think sums up so well what they're trying to teach, and that is this quote: "Sure, he's special, but new research suggests if you tell him that, you'll ruin him. It's a neurobiological fact." A lot of times our intuition isn't right because it comes from our family of origin, right? It comes from the things that we are taught, it comes from the culture. And in fact, a lot of it is based in non-health, in unhealth. But we don't know the context outside of that. Like, we don't know that our context and the context we grew up was a contrived context, right? It wasn't the truth. It was a version of the truth, but it wasn't the truth. My therapist says it this way. She says, no child has a normal childhood. Nobody is normal. And I think a lot of us just assume that what we're taught, what's presented to us in our context growing up, is normal. And so we can't see that. And that's really what therapy and our program tries to do, is once you get out of that context, you can then see it for what it is, which is just one version of reality. So we're going to talk about the research tonight. And in this book, they talk about ideas like confidence, sleep, lying, racial attitudes, intelligence, sibling conflict, teen rebellion, self-control, aggression, gratitude, and the acquisition of language. A lot of things that we assume and take for granted. The idea that the authors had was that this is not that parenting is not a do it by the book, do it by the numbers kind of thing. That one has to take in information and metabolize it, and then have their own expression of it. And so with that idea, they present to us some pretty fascinating concepts. And again, for me, kind of the blend of where I come from and this book is this combination of knowing yourself and then the principles involved in parenting. And to the extent that we don't know ourselves, we can only have access to so many principles, right? I was just out in the field this week working with a group and a therapist, and I had this experience over and over again with the clients, with the students, that the barriers that they imagined were maybe intellectual, that they imagined were academic, were really psychological. Some of the times when we were trying to teach them a principle or present a concept to them, and they were challenged by that the real barrier was an emotional barrier, was resistance. So the chapter talks about self-esteem, the idea of how one values oneself, how one feels about oneself. And they talk about the history of self-esteem research, and it was well established a long time ago that self-esteem was thought to be at the crux of everything in mental health, right? It was the foundation of everything that we think of when we think of somebody being mentally healthy. I think that the authors miss something a little bit. At least the research that they cite misses something a little bit, because they define self-esteem as how one describes or values oneself, right? And we know that that's not necessarily the measure of self-esteem. In fact, we can imagine and probably know people who at least report feeling very good about themselves, but we know actually they don't. We know that it's a cover-up. This idea in the history and the research as the authors present it: without positive self-esteem, psychological growth is stunted. Positive self-esteem operates in effect as the immune system of consciousness, providing resistance, strength, and a capacity for regeneration. So they went back and looked at the review of literature and actually researchers that were tasked with doing a review of the literature. And what they found was that sometimes what was talked about, like I said, as esteem was really just a sense of inflation, which often covers up a real deflation. And this is summarized by this quote from the book. Highly aggressive, violent people happen to think very highly of themselves, debunking the theory that people are aggressive to make up for low self-esteem. At the time, Baumeister was quoted as saying that his findings were the biggest disappointment of my career. Now he's on Dweck's side, speaking of Carol Dweck that we'll talk about a little bit later. Now he's on Dweck's side of the argument, and his work is going in a similar direction. He recently published an article showing that for college students on the verge of failing in class, esteem-building praise causes their grades to sink even further. Baumeister has come to believe the continued appeal of self-esteem is largely tied to parents and their children's achievements. It's so strong that when they praise their kids, it's not far from praising themselves. And we talk about that all the time, right? This over-identification with the child. And that the child's giftedness or success or accomplishments become, for a lot of us, or for all of us to some small degree or large degree, a reflection of our value, of our worth. And so there's an anxiety in all of this idea about praise and esteem, right? There's an anxiety where parents are trying to infuse into their child a sense of positive self-esteem. The problem with that is, we'll talk about that in a few different examples and research studies tonight. The problem with that is that a child can sense that anxiety, at least unconsciously. So that kind of praise that comes from anxiety, worry, and concern that a child doesn't feel good about themselves, it actually feels to the child like they're being insulted, like they're being told that they are fragile or weak or not good enough. We'll talk about that in terms of the research. One quote from this chapter: Thomas didn't want to try things he wouldn't be successful at, his father says. Some things came very quickly to him, but when they didn't, he gave up almost immediately, concluding, I'm not good at this. With no more than a glance, Thomas was dividing the world into two things he was naturally good at and things he wasn't. Right? This was a child, a case study that they gave an example of, who tested in New York City upon entering elementary school at the top 100th percentile in intelligence achievements, academic prowess, right? IQ. And this is what happened with that, right? That he was going to a gifted school and he started to have difficulty completing any task that took any work, because in his mind, in his idea of being gifted, if he couldn't get it, there was no effort, right? There was no fortitude in that equation. He was either gifted or he wasn't, and there was no value. In fact, there was a devaluing of effort, because if it took effort, that meant that he wasn't smart. It wasn't what everybody thought that he was. They talk about in this idea that 85% of parents think it's important, in one study, to tell kids that they're smart. And Paul Bronson says that in his estimation, in New York City, it's more like 100%. But that praise doesn't lead to self-confidence is a premise of this chapter. And that people that get praised for how gifted they are, they want to try things that they can be successful at. They're not going to take healthy risks. They're not going to challenge themselves. They'll often cheat or avoid. They tend to have low frustration tolerance, risk aversion, and a shorter task persistence. They underrate effort and the process, like I said. And like I said, children see this praise as an insult, an expression of the teacher's lack of confidence. So let's talk about praise a little bit. Specific praise can be helpful when you're paying attention to the process and not the outcome. They give an example of a hockey team where they were given lots of praise and they were very successful. But what happened was the coach wouldn't praise winning. He would praise certain acts like passing to the open player, being unselfish, backing each other up, right? A certain fundamental that they might display during practice or during a game. So in that way, you're reinforcing an activity that they have control over. You don't have control over ultimately winning the game. You don't have control over your intellectual capacity at birth. But you do have control over whether or not you practice these skills, whether or not you stick to it. Of course, praise needs to be sincere, but children often interpret it as insincere. Praise to children over the age of 12 is often interpreted as that they are weak and need coddling. There's a nice study that they share about American versus Chinese cultures. And basically what they did was they gave the students, the two sets of students, they gave them equally challenging tests that they were going to struggle with, that was a little bit beyond their capacity. So the children would struggle. And they separated the test into two sessions. So halfway through, the mothers came in and they observed these mothers. And what they found was the Chinese mothers spent time suggesting things like you weren't focused enough. You weren't thinking through this. And then the Chinese mothers would spend time trying to coach and practice and develop approaches to being more successful. Whereas the American mothers oftentimes gave false praise or ignored it and changed the subject, spent the time talking about something else, as if ignoring it would make the difference, wouldn't make the child feel good about themselves. And of course, the result was that the Chinese students in the second half of the test, which was equally difficult, did much, much better than they did in the first half, whereas the American children did the same or worse in the second half. There's another idea in this concept. In fact, Alice Miller talks about this too, this idea that in order that we need to break the link between affection and praise, right? There's this idea in our culture sometimes that admiration is the same as love, and it's not, right? That praising somebody, admiring something about the same thing as offering them love or belonging. And sometimes that's an American idea. So then the child experiences this idea that in order to be loved, to fit in, I have to be good at something in my life. They talk about this idea of intermittent reinforcement. Now, this is just solid behavioral theory. Intermittent reinforcement means that you occasionally reinforce something or praise something. And what we know about intermittent reinforcement is the hardest kind of behavioral reinforcement to extinguish. In other words, when we are intermittently reinforced and the reinforcement goes away, we'll stick with it longer. That's exactly what gambling is. Think of a slot machine. It's an intermittent reinforcement. And of course, when the prize goes away, people tend to pull on the lever over and over and over again. And also they make the argument that consistent, overwhelming, lathered on praise removes the opportunity for the child to experience the intrinsic joy of success. And I talk about this idea of taking a step back and holding on to this idea lightly. Be curious. Say things to your children like, gosh, that's something that it seems like you can feel proud of. Or how do you feel about that? Or something a little bit more mild, like nice job, way to stick with it. You know, but when we come at it with all of our anxiety, when we feel like it's our job, when we feel like our children's self-esteem is so fragile and tenuous that we need to constantly lather them with praise, our experiences, the research says that we tend to undermine their self-confidence in that process. Frequently praised children often demonstrate competition, lying, and cheating, which is profound. So Carol Dweck, a professor at Stanford University, she conducted a study. And basically she split the groups into two. And the research assistants were to utter one line of praise after a test, after a task. And the one line of praise to one group was, you worked really hard on this. And the other one was, you must be really smart about this, smart at this. And then they watched the children, they offered the children a subsequent test. They could do something that was equally as challenging as the first test, or they could do something that was much harder, but might give them the opportunity to grow and to learn something. Of the children that were praised, 90 for effort, 90% of them chose the more challenging test, while less than 50% of the smart praised children chose the more challenging test. Emphasizing effort gives a variable they can control. They come to see themselves as in control of their success. Emphasizing natural intelligence takes it out of the child's control and provides no good recipe for responding to a failure. It's this idea that they're talking about in education of a growth mindset. I was recently in the North Shore of Chicago. When I was there last time, I took in a lecture of another Stanford professor who studied this growth mindset in math. There's this idea in math that people are either good at math or they're not. And she talked about inserting into her math camps and into curriculum in schools this idea of a growth mindset, that the brain is like a muscle, that things can be developed and improved. There was no difference in the instruction. In fact, in her version of the class schedule, the children spent time with this growth mindset idea, examples, skits, and language. They actually had less math instruction than their counterparts. And what the study found was, the ones that were taught this growth mindset, similar to this example with Dr. Dweck, that they scored remarkably, significantly better than those who actually just studied math without the growth mindset part. Dweck and others have found that frequently praised children get more competitive and more interested in tearing others down. Image maintenance becomes their primary concern. Isn't that profound? Right? They have to maintain that. And so in order to maintain that, they have to tear other people down just to survive, just to stay afloat. People with this trait, persistence, rebound well and can sustain their motivation through long periods of time, long periods of delayed gratification. That's a fundamental complaint of parents that we get in our program, is low gratification. And I think for us parents, it becomes a cycle, doesn't it? It becomes a cycle. That when our children struggle, we want to buoy them up with praise, which we learn from this chapter, and the research shows us, actually, it doesn't do no harm. It actually undermines. They have less success, less inclination to persist, less resiliency. And it makes so much common sense now, doesn't it? Compared to what most of us, including me, believed intuitively, or we believed from the culture. By and large, the literature on praise shows that it can be effective, a positive motivating force. In one study, the University of Notre Dame researchers tested praise's efficacy on a losing college hockey team. The experiment worked. This is the story I shared earlier. The team got into the playoffs, but all praise is not equal. And as Dweck demonstrated, the effects of praise can vary significantly depending on the praise given. To be effective, researchers have found praise needs to be specific. The hockey players were specifically complimented on a number of times they checked an opponent. So we don't throw praise out as the baby with the bathwater, but we praise things that are inside of their control. We praise effort. We praise process. We don't praise giftedness and potential. We don't praise it overwhelmingly, lather it on. We don't do it from an anxious place, a worried place, that the child doesn't feel good about themselves. It would be much better in those examples where we're feeling anxious about a child's esteem that we check in with them and listen to them and hear them and empathize with them than it would be to try to correct or fix that by lathering on praise. In another study, this idea of the growth mindset, or the idea that the brain is a muscle. This is a blind study that was done to see if they can improve math scores. It was not the professor that I spoke of, but a very similar example. Same math instructions, but there were skits in education and instruction about how the brain is a muscle. And of course, like I said with the other study, there was statistically significant improvement in the math scores for the group with the brain equals muscle instruction. Right? So again, be wary of, careful of talking about the giftedness, talking about the potential. I can't tell you how many times as a child those things were said to me. And I remember, and I eventually dropped out of high school. And I couldn't have put it into words and articulated it as well as I can today. But a good part of the reason that I dropped out of high school is because I was afraid that I was not going to live up to what everybody thought I was capable of. I was afraid that I wasn't afraid that I wasn't going to get A's. I was afraid that I wasn't going to get the highest grade in my classes. And that wasn't the only thing going on for me as an adolescent, but I specifically remember that. I remember one high school teacher that I had, and I admired him so much. He was so cool. And so, of course, I was most worried about disappointing him or falling out of favor with him. And he was one of the first classes that I failed before I dropped out. And on one particular test, I purposely got every question wrong, including 15 multiple choice questions. Or excuse me, 15 true or false questions. So I had to know the answer. It was almost like I wanted him to know that I knew the answer. It'd been better, smarter, if I got a few wrong. But I wanted to just hide from this fear of failure. He called me up to the class and he gave me actually a good grade after the grading of the test because he knew that I knew the answers. And I couldn't articulate, didn't have the courage to tell him what I felt. But it was that pressure of not living up to my potential. This idea of the brain as a muscle, the only difference between the control group and the test group were 2 lessons, a total of 50 minutes spent teaching not math, but a single idea, that the brain is a muscle. Giving it a harder workout makes you smarter. That alone proved the math scores. I think this is one of the things that really speaks to what we do at Evoke therapy programs, at wilderness therapy programs. It's one of the reasons why we have stuck to a primitive nomadic model when other programs have decided to do recreation or adventure therapy. And again, I'm all for adventure in life, recreation in life. But so many of our kids struggle with so many of these concepts and overcoming and meeting challenges. I have said this, even students who have dramatically resisted our program all the way to the end, I have sensed in all of those students a palpable sense, a feeling that they felt like they accomplished something. And in my experience, there are really 2 fundamental things that we try to do here, that we try to teach both the children and the parents here that have an impact on esteem. And one is dealing with difficult things, dealing with difficult feelings, dealing with difficult tasks, dealing with a wilderness program which is itself inherently difficult, right? The winter is hard, the summer is hard, the spring is hard, the fall is hard. They all have their scourges and their challenges. There's bugs in the summer, there's heat in the summer, there's rain in the spring, there's snow and cold in the winter. In the fall, there's cold rain. All of them have their challenges. But just getting through that gives a person a sense of self-efficacy, which is related to esteem, right? It's that idea, that feeling that what I do makes a difference, that I can do something. So that's the first thing that we try to do, that I think that this program does well. The second thing is resonance, seeing them, hearing them, right? Being a witness to them, their feelings, and who they are, and reflecting back a sense of an okayness with it. Even in their stupidity and their symptoms sometimes. Understanding, one of the things that I was doing with one of the students this week, because he kept trying to be good, right? He was trying to prove to us he was good. He was being cooperative and polite and apologizing when we would try to explore something with him, something that he was struggling with. He wanted to cover it up and not deal with it or explain it away. And we said, no, therapy isn't being good. Therapy is about being you. And if you do something quote unquote bad, we don't think of it as bad. We think of it as a wound or some kind of pain that the symptom itself is serving to mask. So that's the 2 things that we try to do that I think that this book speaks to. Some of the cultural shifts that they talk about is this idea that parents in our culture have replaced work with recreation, right? This idea that it accomplishes the same thing, and it does not, right? For some of us, recreation is just a time to have fun and to bond. and it accomplishes just that. And sometimes there's issues around competence and skill building, absolutely. But work is also helpful to develop those characteristics that we've been talking about all evening on this broadcast, which are delay of gratification, resilience, frustration tolerance, self-efficacy and esteem, and so forth. Thomas Edison opportunity is missed by most people because it is dressed in overalls and looks like work. And then, like I said, with recreation works because everybody is happy, parents feel less stress, guilt, or personal discomfort. Absolutely. I had a student, wasn't our student, but he was rooming with our student years ago in a therapeutic boarding school, and an educational consultant was visiting the school, and he was talking to the two roommates. And the one was saying to the other, I went to, and he named an adventure therapy program. And our student, our graduate, said, what is that? He said, well, it's the program you send your kids to when you don't have the guts to send them to a real wilderness program. Right? This decision, this difficulty, this challenge that children go through at Evoke is a powerful one. It's a transformative one. It's not an easy one. It takes effort. It takes mindfulness. You can't take much for granted in the process. Some kind of conclusions about self-esteem from my perspective. It's a sense of being okay, not being good, right? Self-esteem isn't convincing yourself that you're good. Self-esteem is coming to terms with your wholeness, your humanness. Not just your strengths, but your weaknesses, all of it. And in knowing that that's okay. It's what Carl Jung meant when he said, I would rather be whole than good. It's what I mean when I talk about accepting the horrible, rotten self or coming to terms with being an idiot. I use this example from the 2004 Red Sox versus Alex Rodriguez, a baseball player. Alex Rodriguez was touted in his time, he's been retired for a couple of years now, he was touted in his time to be the next Babe Ruth, the next Hank Aaron, the greatest player in history. They thought he had a chance to break all of their records, and he came close. But he struggled early on in his career in pressure situations because the weight of that idea that he was the next gifted, most special player ever was too much. At least that's my psychological interpretation. And perhaps most importantly, Alex Rodriguez was busted for steroid use a few times. Performance enhancing drug. He followed the model, right? He was told he was a gifted prodigy, and he cracked under pressure, didn't have the resilience, and he cheated. The exact same. Compare that to the 2004 Red Sox, the team that came back, I think they were up 3-1 in the series against the Yankees. In the 8th inning, they were losing. And they called themselves a band of idiots. That was their nickname. Long hair, beards, disheveled uniforms, sloppy uniforms. Could laugh at themselves and joke about themselves. They had no pressure. When you admit that you're an idiot, there's no pressure. And they did something that nobody in history had ever done to come back from that deficit. They may have been down 3-0. I might be correct in saying that it wasn't 3-1 out of a 7-game series, which means they were about to lose the 4th game and lose the series. Nobody had ever done what they did in history. They were scrappy. And so esteem is that idea that I'm okay, that I'm an idiot sometimes, that I make mistakes, that I dent my children. Of course, I also am kind and loving and all that stuff, but that's not hard to accept. That's just there. It's coming to terms with our darkness, coming to terms with our horrible, rotten self that is the key to self-esteem. And my experience as a clinician, as a wilderness therapy founder, and also as a client myself, is the best way for that to happen is to be found. Like Jessica Benjamin said, and I quote her in my book, the root of the self is found through another person. To be found and seen by another person consistently gives us an experience that we're okay. Even when what shows up is our horrible, rotten self. I talk about this idea in the acknowledgments in my book. The greatest gift, one of the greatest things my mother ever did for me, and my mother was wonderfully flawed, was she took me to therapy, and through the course of therapy, specifically in one session, I told my mother all the horrible things about her. And I'm sure some of them were difficult to listen to. I'm sure some of them she disagreed with, and I'm sure some of them she agreed with, and it was incredibly painful to hear. That was powerful. That was heroic. But what was absolutely the most amazing is she brought me back, and we did it again. And she kept bringing me back. We didn't do it every session after that, but she brought me back, and she came back. Fundamentally, the skill is listening, deep listening, active listening, non-judgmental listening, containing, and allowing children to struggle and suffer authentically. A great psychiatrist, psychologist, Carl Jung, also said that neuroses is a substitute form of legitimate suffering. And so part of what this program does for us, for you, for your family, for your child, is give them a safe place to struggle authentically. Give them a place where they can learn to feel and struggle and overcome. By William Glasser, no human being will work hard at anything unless they believe they are working for competence. And lastly, this idea about what's our resistance to this process, right? First of all, part of it is just cultural, right? There's so much pressure in our society on us as parents and what we produce in terms of our children. And that leads to this kind of over-identification, right? It takes a lot of heroic strength. Those of you who are in this process know it takes a lot of heroic strength to show up and to distance yourself from the shame when your child is struggling, that you're okay and that it's not about you. Well, obviously, we have an instinct as parents to avoid pain and to avoid what I call empathic suffering by watching our children struggle. What I contend is there is no sound that is more difficult to hear than your own child crying and suffering. I fly a lot, travel a lot, and there are sometimes crying babies on airplanes. And I don't enjoy that, obviously. It's unpleasant. Because to watch a child struggle is difficult. But it's nothing compared to my child crying. Nothing. It's what gives me capacity to do for you and your children what is so difficult for you to do with your children, which is when your child is crying, I can have perspective and empathy and detachment and see how valuable it is and sit with them. When my children cry, my own children cry, that exact same way of being with them is nearly impossible. This idea that, again, we substitute praise for love, admiration for love. We equate the same thing. It's extraordinarily harmful. The anxiety, the success, the objectification, turning the child into an object, that's just a mere reflection of us. Focus on outcome versus the process, right? I talk about this all the time. One of the things that I try to teach the families that I work with one-on-one oftentimes is to value failure, to value the detour. And again, because we get so attached to it and we're so close to it as parents, it's difficult. I can offer the perspective because I have more distance. Letting go of control. And then, of course, learning to forgive yourself. I talk about this idea that when a parent doesn't forgive themselves, when they don't do that, they will make excuses for their children, right? Well, it was our divorce. Well, I was yelling too much. Well, I drank. Well, I was gone a lot, right? And this is not an abdication of parental responsibility, but coming to terms with oneself. and forgiving oneself. And what that looks like is it's okay to hold the child accountable. It's okay to have expectations for the child that they have to meet, or that there are a natural or logical consequence. That's okay. I remember, I'll end with this story before I go to questions. I was working with a mother who was considering sending her daughter to our program years ago, a couple of years ago. And she was telling me about her process, and she apparently, by her own report, had an incredibly acrimonious divorce, really a war in the family. And the daughter had been right in the middle of all of this. And among other things, she brought that to her therapist. And she was talking about the struggles of her daughter. And at one point, she was saying to the therapist, I feel like I was a horrible parent, I was a failure. And then she shared this with me. She said, and my therapist pointed out, I wasn't that horrible of a parent. I was pretty good, and gave examples. So she said, at first I thought it was all my fault, and then I realized it was none of my fault. And I said to her, I think there's actually a third category. And it's really what I think is the most valuable way of thinking about this, is to say, yeah, some of it was your fault. Yes, you dented your child. And yes, you did some wonderful things for your child. You weren't all good or all bad. You were a lot of both. And that's okay. You're not horrible, condemned to suffer forever for that. But you can just learn, and hopefully in this process, in this program, if you choose to send your daughter, you can learn to look at that and accept that. And you don't need to be good. You can just be you in the process. All right, Stephanie, I'm happy to take any questions that have come in related to the topic or not, and then I have some announcements, and then we will end again at the very end with any live questions. Looks like there are no questions so far. All right, I'll go through announcements, and then if there are any questions that come in, we can address those. We ask all parents, while their children are with us, to attend 6 12-step support groups. Some version, some combination of Al-Anon, Codependence Anonymous, Families Anonymous. You can also go to NAMI.org and search for affordable or free classes in your area, resources in your area. Please follow us on social media for announcements, for if you want announcements, if you want invitations to things. You can also listen to all of these broadcasts via the podcast app on your iPhone or iOS device. Go to the podcast app and search Evoke Therapy Programs. If you have an Android device, download the SoundCloud app and search Evoke Therapy Programs and subscribe there. Download those. You can listen to them on a plane, on the train, during your commute. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at evoketherapy.com. Excuse me, at Evoke Therapy. Follow us on Facebook by searching Evoke Therapy Programs. You can also go to the Second Nature Alumni Foundation on Facebook. They're going to rename that soon, but that's what it is right now. And you can go to the Facebook page if you want to be involved. In fact, they're interested in looking for board members, people that have some experience in raising money and working in a nonprofit. So this is an organization for people who can't afford therapy, to raise money for them. And then, of course, go to our Evoke Therapy blog to look at articles. The book, The Journey of the Rogue Parent, is on Amazon. It is finally back in stock in the Amazon warehouse after being off for some time. So you can go to Amazon.com for that. You can also buy an Audible or CD purchase there. The Cascades workshop's coming up. The next one is in January, the 21st and the 20th and the 21st. These are for current families. It's an experiential multifamily group. You get to work with the staff. You can also combine it if your child is at Evoke or at Entrada. You can combine it with a field visit if your child's therapist thinks it's appropriate. Contact Gail at evoketherapy.com. Our upcoming therapeutic intensives and retreats, Finding You, is for individuals. If you want to do deeper work, these are fantastic. In fact, the grand opening of our Summit Lodge in Park City was today. So you can go to our website and look at the pictures of that there. Excuse me. The next one is Finding You, January 11th through 14th. You can also schedule a private family intensive with me. This is for any family to do deeper work. Excuse me. Private family intensives are for any family that wants to work on relationship, conflict, codependency, trauma, building a stronger family relationships. Email intensives@evoketherapy.com for more information. The upcoming parent support groups, we'll be putting some more on the calendar, but for now, I'll be in the Bay Area in a very special one, combining with Palo Alto Preparatory School. I'll be speaking there 6:30 to 8:30 on January 10th. Then I'll be back in New York City on Monday, January 22nd at CUNY. Email Andrea@evoketherapy.com for more information. Pursuits, programs, and trips are adventure trips, international trips for families or young adults who want to have sober fun or therapy light. This is a recreation to kind of get a refresher, to touch on it, doing some fun stuff. Question comes in from a parent. What can we do best to correct mistakes we have made in the overpraised category once kids are off to college? I think more than anything, you can just course correct. That's what I would say. You know, developing a new sensibility, being accountable, maybe even naming it and apologizing for mistakes you made, all of those things are fantastic for children. For you to make a mistake and to admit to it is fantastic. And most of the time they'll dismiss it and tell you it was okay, it was no big deal. That's okay. You know, I talk about this with parents all the time. Talking about your disease of codependency or anxiety or whatever it is, you know, putting that in the water, so to speak, of the family's life. It changes the focus from them to you. And it's not a one-time or a two-time thing that you say. It's a way of being with them. Like, hey, I've made mistakes, or I just learned this new thing about praise. And then just changing it. It doesn't come easily because it's not natural for most of us. They make that point in the chapter over and over again. It takes practice. And you don't have to be perfect at any of this ever. If your children need you to be perfect, you're doomed. What they need you to do is be a project that you own. So name it, admit to it, apologize for it, talk about where it comes from, talk about your disease, and then course correct. Try to set a course for doing it differently. Those would be the things that I would say would make the biggest difference. All right, folks. Next one will be part 2. It actually won't be, it says on the slide here, Monday, December 18th. It'll actually be Tuesday, December 19th. In fact, Monday, December 18th is the 10th anniversary of the very first webinar. The reason I know that, because it's also my daughter's 10th birthday, and she was born on the day that I did my first webinar. So I'm going to celebrate her birthday with her, and I'm going to do the webinar on Tuesday, December 19th at 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. I hope these are helpful for you. I hope it's a helpful point of contact. I encourage you to continue to fill your life up with this new sensibility. Talk to people who have been through it. Talk to people that are farther down the road. Surround yourself with this new way of thinking so that the old brain, the way that we were kind of raised, what we thought, what was the truth, gets challenged in the process. And we can now develop this new sensibility and way of being with ourselves first and with others, particularly our children next. Have a great week. Take care, and I'll talk to you on Tuesday. Bye-bye.